culinary procedures, coconut winemaking, coconut or cooking with coconut milk. For weaving techniques, we have ikat and migrants from the Philippines and Indonesia to the Americas. With the Pacific Ocean now a major theater for global exchanges, it is time to revive coconut exchanges and project with new ones. So with that, allow me to invite you to the singing of the Philippine National Anthem so we can formally begin our program.
Diplomats in Manila how they view the quincentennial from their respective lens, reaffirming our historical connections. Tonight and tomorrow, we go even deeper by showcasing Filipino, Mexican, Argentine, Chilean, and Brazilian experts and their academic researches on these connections that define our identity as Filipinos, further shining a spotlight on the historical and cultural kinship we share with our cousins from across the Pacific. having a shared cultural and historical heritage can contribute to stronger and mutually beneficial political and economic ties with Latin America. It gives us an advantage in terms of exploring new ideas of cooperation, trade, and investment that we hope to maximize even further. I believe these academic discussions will rekindle that connection, which was first established by that fateful journey by Magellan. Much has been said about the Pacific Ocean being a major theater for global exchanges that drive and fuel our modern world today. But looking back, we can say that this is simply a continuation of Magellan's legacy and the galleon trade that came after it. This event is a timely reminder that there is still much to learn and gain from our Pacific backyard, where the next frontier of our bilateral relations lies. On this note, I wish to thank our partners for making this online event possible. The National Quincentennial Committee, particularly the chairperson of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, Dr. Rene Escalante, the DFA Office of Public and Cultural Diplomacy, headed by Assistant Secretary Eduardo Martin Meñez, the Philippine Academic Consortium for Latin American Studies, currently chaired by Dr. Ferdinand Llanes, and the embassies of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico in Manila. We look forward to insightful presentations and a dynamic open forum for the two panels. May this event serve as a catalyst for even more exchanges between Southeast Asia and Latin America, and further strengthening of Philippine bilateral relations with Latin American countries. Thank you and mabuhay.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for gracing tonight's occasion. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay. So we have three resource experts, three panelists who will share rich experiences as regards Philippines and Mexico relations. To start with, our panelist number one is Dr. Paulina Machuca from Mexico, who will talk about the Philippine heritage in Mexico, a continuing history. Dr. Paulina Machuca is a research professor at El Colegio de Michoacan and a visiting professor at the University of Toulouse in France from 2021 to 2022. In recent years, she has specialized in the history of biocultural exchanges between Mexico and the Philippines from the 16th to 18th centuries. Among her most recent publications are the book coordinated with Thomas Calvo, titled Mexico y Filipinas, Culturas y Memorias sobre el Pacífico, published by El Colegio de Michoacan and the Ateneo de Manila University in 2016. And the book titled Historia Minima de Filipinas, published by El Colegio de Mexico in 2019. In the same year, she received the Francisco Javier Clavijero Award for the Best History Book in Mexico, titled El Vino de Cocos en la Nueva España, Historia de una Transculturación en el siglo XVII, in which she analyzes the introduction of the coconut palm tree and the production of lambanog by the Filipinos on the Mexican Pacific coast. She has been a visiting professor at various academic institutions in France, in Spain, and also in the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to give you the floor to Dr. Paulina Machuca. Good evening. Buenos dias.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the Philippine International Quincentennial Conference, as well as the Mexican Embassy in the Philippines, for their kind invitation to participate in this important event. I am ready to share my presentation. Can you see it?
Yes, yes, it's clear.
Thank you. Several years ago, I started a historical research on coconut wine, or vino de cocos, in Colima, Mexico. I wanted to inquire about the production of this distilled beverage of Philippine origin during the 17th century in New Spain, and why it was stopped at some point during the colonial era. When I had completed my research in the archives of Mexico and Spain, I felt that I was missing something important, and that my book would not be complete without knowing its elaboration. but no longer in Colima, but in the Philippines. That is how, in April 2012, I did my first field work in that archipelago, and the world opened before my eyes. Beyond the process of making coconut wine, which is called lambanog in the Philippines, I realized that the natural and cultural exchange that the Manila Galleon meant had been in an extensive scale, and that Mexican and Filipino culture had enriched each other with social elements that traveled to both sides of the Pacific. With the premise of knowing more about these exchanges, I returned to the Philippines in the following years and traveled through Luzon, the Visayas, and Mindanao. The field experience allowed me to contrast the biocultural exchanges of the Philippines in Mexico, especially on the coastal areas of the Mexican Pacific. Throughout these years, I have been able to verify that the history of the Manila Galleon is a living history that can still be seen in various Mexican and Philippine regions. It is not a story of the past, but continues in the present. For this reason, in this presentation, I will make a general reflection on Philippine influence in Mexico based on some works that I have published in the last years. Much has been written about the objects transported by the Manila Galleon: porcelain and silks from China, biombos and furniture from Japan, ivory artifacts, plants and spices from Southeast Asia, as well as a great diversity of textiles that can even came from the Estado de India of Portugal. But beyond the transportation of goods, we must bear in mind that there were thousands of Asians who crossed the Pacific Ocean and arrived in Mexico with their own cultural baggage, their beliefs, their techniques, and their traditional knowledge that they soon reproduced in their places of destiny. Mexican culture has been nourished by the Trans-Pacific experience that lasted 250 years, from the turn of 1565 to 1815, when, in the middle of independence process, the trips of the so-called Pacific trade were definitively interrupted. Therefore, in this presentation, I will discuss about 5 elements that seem crucial to understanding the Philippine influence in Mexico, namely the introduction of the distillation technique from coconut wine, the influence on coastal gastronomy, ikat as a dyeing technique, the lyric space, and finally, the vocabulary of Filipino origin. One of the greatest contributions of the Filipinos who arrived with the galleon was the introduction of the distillation technique, which later gave rise to the first mezcals in New Spain. Since the end of the 16th century, and especially during the 17th century, in the current states of Colima and Guerrero, plantations of coconut palms were established, where lambanog was made. This beverage can reach up to 40 to 50 degrees of alcoholic volume. These Filipinos were called vinateros, and they used a rustic steel that consisted of a hollow wooden log to which a copper saucepan was placed on top, and the set was mounted on an oven installed on the ground. Said oven can still be seen today in some artisanal mezcal distilleries, such as that of Macario Partida family in Zapotitlan de Vadillo, Jalisco, Mexico, as you can see on the slide. How was coconut wine made? First, the vinatero had to climb the palm tree twice a day, once in the morning and once in the afternoon, to collect the accumulated sap. This sap is known as tuba, which today is the typical drink of the state of Colima, Mexico, and a symbol of local identity. But in colonial times, that tuba was actually the raw material for coconut wine, as it was left to ferment for a few days until the masters of making wine, or the maestros de hacer vino, distilled it and stored it in pearl jars to then be transported to the main towns and cities such as Guadalajara, Mexico City, and above all, the mining areas of the center and north of New Spain. Currently, lambanog is still being made in some parts of the Philippines, but in Mexico it stopped being produced at the beginning of the 18th century. Lambanog had a great influence in the origin of the first mezcals, or tequila. In fact, the first historical reference to mezcal production are those of the southern region of Jalisco, and they are related to the coconut wine production model from the old province of Colima. Mezcal production was possible thanks to the convergence of millenary knowledge, that of the coconut culture in Asia and that of the agave culture in Mesoamerica. Regarding to the coconut tree that the Filipinos shared with us, we must not forget that it was on the Pacific coast where it was most deeply rooted for two simple reasons: due to geographical conditions similar to those of the Philippines, and also because it was there where the largest Filipino population settled. They influenced gastronomy, architecture, and in general daily life. A document from the town of Colima, dating from the year of 1612, mentions that the inhabitants, including the Spaniards, obtained multiple benefits from coconut: food, drink, medicine, and house. They made coconut oil, vinegar, milk, and sugar, and they used to replace olive oil and other Spanish products. The incorporation of spices, as well as various tropical fruits from Asia, significantly enriched the flavors of Mexican dishes and desserts, which were already a mixture of Mesoamerica and Europe culture. Pepper, ginger, nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon became indispensable ingredients in cookbooks, but also grated coconut or coconut milk. Fruits such as tamarind and mango, which also arrived with the galleon, took root in the hot, humid areas of the Mexican Pacific, while the ceviche, called kinilaw in the Philippines, must have established itself as one of the most popular coastal dishes to date. Tuba vinegar, which is commonly used in the archipelago, is still sold in some markets in Colima, Mexico, although very little known in other parts of our country. In the Costa Grande region of Guerrero, along the Acapulco-Zihuatanejo coastline, guinatan is a dish of Philippine origin that consists of dried fish bathed in coconut milk and guajillo chili, garlic and salt, and oregano. This dish has become a traditional element in the municipality of Coyuca de Benítez, 32 kilometers from Acapulco. And no wonder, one of the largest Filipino settlements was established in that area during colonial times. In New Spain, the ante de coco was a popular dessert. In the convent of San Jerónimo in the 17th century, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, one of the greatest exponents of New Spain literature, was already savoring this dish as a result of New Spain conventual cuisine. The ante de coco is also found in the Libro de Cocina del Hermano Fray Jerónimo de Pelayo, dated 1780, as well as in two Mexican kitchen manuscripts from the 18th century. The coconut jam and the conserva de granadita from China, which also included coconut among its main ingredients, functioned as desserts that delighted the multicultural society of New Spain. Another protagonist in the Philippine gastronomic influence is rice. At the end of the 16th century, a Filipino named Gaspar was the cook at the Acapulco hospital, where he prepared rice, spice dishes, and various foods similar to those of Southeast Asia. And in the town of Tecpan de Galeana in 1649, the presence of Filipino people was reported. Their agricultural labor included rice, corn, cocoa, coconuts, cotton, vanilla, and tamarinds. It is no coincidence that today, in various towns of the Costa Grande of Guerrero, near Acapulco, rice is the main companion of food, replacing the tortilla or bread. The world of textiles experienced real changes in the first globalization, both in the use of materials, designs, and techniques. In Mexico, there are two major Asian inheritances, but whose origin has been erased from memory: the rebozo de bolita and the paliacate. The typical Mexican rebozos, shawls, very colorful and with small white dots, are made with a Philippine dyeing technique called ikat, which consists of creating patterns by tying the strands to be dyed. Artisanal reboceros workshops, such as in La Piedad, Michoacán, Mexico, they use this art to create colorful rebozos de bolita that have become a symbol of national identity, as you can see on the slide. And the paliacate, one of the national symbols par excellence, actually has its name thanks to the port of Paliacate or Pulicat on the Coromandel coast of India, a production area of printed textiles for several centuries, and which was incorporated to global trade after the European expansion of the 16th century. Usually bright red in color, this particular garment would have been marketed from Paliacate to the Philippines and from there to the New Spain. It should not be surprising that the main motif stamped on the paliacate is the paisley or the bote, a curved drop of water whose symbol has its roots not in Mesoamerica, not in Europe, but in Persian culture. On the other hand, the fabric of cambaya, also originally from India, has become Mexicanized to such an extent that our country is a benchmark in the production of this textile. The Asian influence was also transmitted to us from the ludic space. In Colima, when I was a child, I played charangay or changais with some wooden sticks that had to be suspended in the air and then tossed as far as possible. It is a type of game that is known not only in the Philippines, but also in other Asian nations. Unfortunately, there are no studies in this regard, and apparently the game of changais or charangais has already disappeared in Mexico due to changes in children's hobbies, which have become more individualized and more oriented to video games and their entertainment offered by new technologies. On the other hand, we know that the cockfight that took place on the coastal areas of the Mexican Pacific has a notable Philippine influence, and as this is also a topic to be explored in the future. Mexicans use Filipino words, but whose origin they do not know. In addition to tuba, another word in common use is palapa, a term that was extended in Mexico to designate the roofs made with palm leaves, mainly from the coconut tree. Precisely, other Filipino words used in regional Mexican architecture are the batalan and the arigue. The batalan designates a kind of a balcony or terrace, while the arigue, which comes from aligi, refers to the wooden posts or beams that serve as support for other materials in construction. In some coastal areas, we still hear about the panga or boat, or the parian to refer to the Chinese market. Let's not forget that in Mexico City, there was the great parian of the Plaza Mayor in colonial times, while currently there is still the so-called Parian de Tlaquepaque in Jalisco. It should be noted that many of these words are not mentioned in the dictionary of the Real Academia Española de la Lengua, and that they survive as local expressions. Just as Mexican culture has been enriched over time, thanks to the contact with the Philippines, the same can be said of Philippine culture. The galleon brought to the archipelago corn, cocoa, and a large number of fruits and vegetables that still retain the Nahua name, as you can see on the slide. Chile, chico, tomate, camote, guamuchil, sacalasuchil, and a long etc. Artifacts of such Mesoamerican roots, such as the metate, reach the Philippines and still retain their name. They, however, are used for grinding cocoa, not corn, as in Mexico. Scenes that are so familiar on the streets of Mexico, such as the esquite vendors or corn vendors, are also very common in the Philippines and on Philippine streets, so that a Mexican visitor feels at home, as we can see on the slide, a corn vendor in Cebu. Why has all this Philippine heritage been forgotten from the Mexican historical memory? Is it because this influence is mostly circumscribed to a regional space in the Mexican Pacific and not the center? Is it because, since the 19th century, we took for granted that what was not of Mesoamerican origin would necessarily have to be of European origin? Perhaps the best known legend to us in this history of exchanges is that of the China Poblana, a young woman from India who was sold as a slave in the Philippines and from there went to New Spain, where she was acquired by a wealthy merchant from Puebla de Los Angeles and where she was known as Catarina de San Juan. But beyond the China Poblana, there is a whole heritage that survives to this day as a result of our exchanges with Asia. It took us a long time as a nation to recognize the Afro descendants as our third root, and it is now time to recognize that in Mexican culture, Filipino heritage is our fourth root. Maraming salamat.
Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Paulina Machuca. Your presentation is very interesting. Thank you for sharing your research findings, your insights to all of us. I'm sure all these 184 attendees are really familiar with some of the terminologies that you've mentioned. I, for one, I am a language specialist in the Philippines. So basically, when I was hearing your presentation, you mentioned about tuba, you mentioned about ginataan, you mentioned about coco jam, but we have our own local term for coco jam. In the Tagalog variety, we call it ginaok. It's called ginaok in the Tagalog variety. And then you also mentioned about cockfighting. In our local terminology, we call it sabong, but this has become popularized nowadays. There is what we call online sabong, and it's called talpak or talpakan in the modern in the modern terminology here in the Philippines. And then you also mentioned about palapa ng nyog or palapa. We call it palapa ng nyog or palm tree. So these are the things that I'm sure our attendees or participants across across our archipelago from Luzon to Mindanao who are with us tonight, I'm sure they have questions, they have something to ask you later on after the three presentations. But thank you very much for this presentation. It's really a wonderful one. I think there's more to come as far as collection of linguistic corpus or language or vocabulary is concerned. There's more that we need to to add on the relationship between Philippines and Mexico. Thank you very much again, Dr. Machuca. Thank you so much. Okay, so our second panelist is Dr. Cuauhtémoc Villamar, who will talk about the Manila Galleon system, cultural change on both sides of the Pacific Ocean. But before I give the virtual floor to Dr. Villamar, allow me to introduce him first. Dr. Villamar is a retired career diplomat from the Mexican Foreign Service who served for 3 decades primarily in Asia. He was posted in China twice, Singapore, Thailand, and Canada, specializing in economic and cultural promotion as well as technical cooperation. He was the first representative of Mexico to the APEC, or Asia Pacific Cooperation Organization. At the ministry, he served as Director of Foreign Service and at the International Liaison of the Diplomatic Academy. Since 2009, Dr. Villamar writes a blog about the Manila Galleon and the history of mutual cultural influences between Asia and the Americas from the vantage point of the Philippines. The name is La Nauva, or in English, it's called The Ship Goes. After his retirement, he obtained in 2020 the PhD in History at the National University of Singapore with a research about an informal merchant network active at the time of the creation of the commercial system known as Manila Galleon from 1565 to 1600. In 2021, he published a book for Routledge Taylor and Francis, focused on the maritime trade, cities, and commercial circuits in the Southeast Asia in the early modern in connection with the Pacific Basin. Dr. Villamar is married to Mrs. Netnapit Tasakorn. They have 2 children and grandson currently living in Thailand. Ladies and gentlemen, let us give the virtual floor to Dr. Villamar. Hi, good evening.
Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, the guests, the participants for this opportunity to present part of the different research actually. And I think I will follow up the contribution of Dr. Paulina Machuca that portrayed very well the influence of the Philippines in Mexico. I will share my screen with them. I hope it's visible.
Yes, yes.
Great.
Thank you.
For this presentation, I will refer to 3 sets of information using different levels of approach. First, a vision of Asia from the standpoint of an imperial administrator in New Spain. Second, the role of the private merchants as members of commercial networks of the Manila Galleon. And third, but no less important, the role of the Chinese immigrant in Manila, known as Anglais, as creator of material culture. The voices recovered from these 3 stories are essentially different from actors of the cross-cultural exchange in the framework of the Manila Galleon system. The purpose is to take a transversal look at the historical development of the Pacific during the early modern era. This approach allows us observing the changes from the level of inhabitants in Asia and the American viceroyalties directly connected with the Trans-Pacific trade. This perspective tries to show the dynamism typical of Asian societies, which ran parallel to the transformation on the American societies under the European domination. These were, of course, different processes, but there were several coincidences in the economic interest. The benefits or disparities derived from trading, and less evident at that moment, the acquisition of cultural expressions. The inauguration of the Manila Galleon route during the last quarter of the 16th century accelerated the mobility of segments of humanity within the enormous space under the rule of the Spanish monarchy, and also the lives of many travelers worldwide. This process of planetary connection was the result of multiple previous changes in different locations in the world that were forged in distant times. The trade, the intense cultural exchange, and the migration of people of all levels from remote places took advantage of the contact established by notable navigators, Vasco da Gama, Ferdinand Magellan, Juan Elcano, López de Legazpi, Andrés Urdaneta, among others. But it can carry out a capillarity level by thousands of individuals affected by the Manila Galleon connection through the Pacific Ocean. European missionaries and merchants, Spanish administrators, Filipino sailors, Mexican soldiers, Japanese Christians, Asian slaves were involved in the whirlwind of cultural exchanges. Multiple connected stories uncovered in archives in recent decades show the intensification of this cross-pollination of the world during the early modern era. It is worth mentioning that the Viceroyalty of New Spain was designated to oversee the administration of the Philippines, while the Spanish monarchy maintained a distant control of Asia and American affairs through the Council of Indies. Let us not forget that the Castilians who occupied the Philippines in 1571 had previous experience in America, only a generation removed from the destruction of the American and Peruvian empires, which gave the Europeans some awareness of how they wanted to act in Asia. Let's start with the first person, the first identity that it's important to observe the upper level, the vision of the empire. This is the view of Asia by a bishop from a high-level administrator of the empire. And the source is his book, little known, History of the Conquest of China by the Great Barbarian, that was written between 1644 and published in Europe in Paris in 1670. The 1640s were a bad time for the Spanish monarchy. It was the end of the 60 years of the Iberian Union, a dynastic agreement that gave the King of Spain the crown of Portugal in 1580. It must be said that during 6 decades, the Portuguese administrators in Asia, represented by the Estado de India, was autonomous, but under the supervision of the Spanish crown. With the War of Restoration of Portugal, 1640 to 1668, Spain lost the relative control over extensive territories in Portugal in Asia. It was exactly 1640 when Bishop Juan de Palafox arrived in New Spain to take charge of the religious province of Puebla. The Spanish prelate had to face immediately the threat of local revolts, the unrest in the religious ranks, and in June 1642, the bishop received secret and urgent orders from the Spanish crown to arrest Viceroy Diego López Pacheco, the 7th Duke of Escalona. Spain's political instructions were exceptional due to unsettling conditions on the other side of the Atlantic. Portuguese independence, the revolt of Catalonia, and the war with the Dutch triggered consequences in Europe and in overseas possessions to prevent the contagion of political instability. The Duke of Escalona was a first cousin of the Duke of Braganza, crowned King John IV at the beginning of the Portuguese Restoration War. After the arrest of the Duke and his deportation to Spain, Bishop Palafox assumed the Viceroyalty of New Spain for almost a year. After that turbulent period, he returned to continue his duties in Puebla. Juan de Palafox lived in Mexico from 1640 to 1649 until the protection of Count Duke Olivares. By orders of the crown, his task was to contribute to reorganize the empire, to reduce abuses of the colonies, but above all, to combat the corruption of Europeans living in Mexico that dented the king's coffer. The economic burden of sustaining the constant wars in Europe demanded additional economic support from the American economies. After this event, the Viceroy started to collect information from Philippines, mostly, to get informed about what was happening in the Philippines, but in general in Asia. Let's think that the Viceroy had an overview of the conflicts in Europe, the necessities in the Americas, and the idea or ideals about what to do in Asia. he he received negative opinions from the Jesuits in China and started the famous controversy of the rights, Chinese rights. It was, however, a very important moment for the development of the American territories, American viceroyalties, especially Mexico and Peru. And this is considered an outstanding moment of Baroque distinction in the Americas, including the magnificent Cathedral of Puebla and the library that he donated to the city. This is the book, the cover of his book, published in Paris in 1670. In this description of what was happening in China, the fall of the Ming Dynasty, and the arrival of a foreign dynasty that anyway became Chinese in many ways, the Qing Dynasty. He described an incredible amount of events of what was really happening in China. It was like a reporter, like a journalist, day by day, month by month, with all the information that he received from the Philippines. It's remarkable, this level of detail and the way in which he provides this information in the book. He was obviously interested on this topic of Asia because in 1630s, before going to Mexico, he was member of the Council of Indies. He received several reports from the Philippines before arriving to Mexico, but he was not able to go to Asia. However, he continued providing information about Asia and providing what we can call now strategy and policymaking rules. The book of Bishop Palafox tried to tell the European rulers that the conduction of an empire as big as, in this case, China, can be a failure of huge proportions. And he was reporting in order to provide the feedback necessary for the empire, the Spanish Empire, about what was happening in Asia. The reality is that in many ways, the Chinese and China dynasty, China Empire, and the Spanish Empire were connected without properly knowing the implications and the level of connections that already existed through trade, through the silver, through the exchanges. And he perceived these elements. He was able to portray this impressive level of information. He also reported about the trade, the system of labor, and of course about the Manila Galleon. This is the part of the Palafoxian library that is still you can visit in Mexico, in Puebla. It's an incredible library to the top level comparative to any big library of the times, of the Baroque times in Europe. Let me stop a minute about the concept itself of the Manila Galleon system. I insist to call Manila Galleon system because it was not just a trading mechanism. It was really an imperial form of organizing the trade in order to provide security to the exchange of merchandise. Also, to provide the necessary legality to the transactions and the predictability of transportation. That's why the crown took care of the property of the galleons and security of trade. It was such an important element for the continuity of the trade. That's why also the crown took care of the protection of the galleons along the route. we know now, and I will not insist more about the level of exchanges on merchandises of all kinds, and also the exchange in biological terms that existed across the Pacific. One point to consider in terms of Peru, the separation that the Crown decided about between Peru and New Spain in order to protect the trade, particularly the one that is connected to the Atlantic, because the Spanish rulers knew perfectly that a union or a contact in economic terms of the two major producers of silver in the world could lead into a difficult problem, including the independence of these viceroyalties. And I pass to the second portrait. I will go quite quickly, quite fast, because I am referring back in time to 1587, in which there is an important issue, exactly in the moment in which the definition of the Manila Galleon as a system was in discussion in the Council of Indias. In this case, the viceroy of the time, Álvaro Manrique de Zúñiga, Marqués de Villamanrique, ordered an inspection of the galleon San Martin that arrived that year in Acapulco. The report went to the Crown in Spain the year after, and they discovered a large amount of products and goods that were not declared. That the intention of the viceroy was precisely to expose the traders of Manila that were in part Mexicans in order to push them to pay their taxes. At that time, the exchange of products in the Manila Galleon was not the fancy high-end products, but relatively simply, clothing, silk, wax, gold bullion. In exchange of silver, they received bullion, and it was a good trade, and white incense. And even in the declaration, they discovered a live civet cat. That is part of the tendency of the time of introducing animals and plants that could be used in other places. That's why it's so direct, the influence of Asia in America and vice versa from America into Asia. The introduction of products like porcelains of Spain was probably not in large quantities, but we can see how the copy of these products, Chinese products, became national or Mexicanized in order to copy what it was, what came from Asia. The third experience that I want to show is essentially the image of the Sangley artists, these anonymous producers of material culture that were able to introduce a large amount of products of high quality, and being sojourners, being travelers between China and the Philippines, or probably from other places into the Philippines, were able to introduce this kind of new products that were adapted to the needs and desires of the consumers far away in America and in Europe. Bishop Salazar made a report in 1590 in which he is amazed. He described the Parian in Manila, and he described the abilities of the Chinese traders, but also manufacturers, also artisans, that they could reproduce almost everything from horse saddles to shoes or clothes or any kind of product that the Spaniards or other merchants wanted. The Chinese were able to produce. It was a lively market in which everything was really available in very good prices, according to these reports of different chronists. But the letter of Salazar is particularly interesting because he refers to the capacity of the Chinese Sanglays to reproduce even art European style. We are talking about the last part of the 16th century. And one of the most attractive products that they could develop was precisely the carving of an ivory. And this is interesting. I'm not a specialist in history of art history. However, it's possible to observe what is called the trajectory of the products. The trajectory of the products is describing the communication that existed globally, and we can observe through a particular material culture that is available in museums, in private collections, in different places. In Manila, as in other cities in Asia, the ivory arriving from Africa or India was transformed into these small pieces. In many ways, is considered some kind of reproduction of what did they have as experience previously culturally. They have the background to produce this, but for different kind of consumers. And in this case, the church demanding this kind of products allow them to express freely and with incredible ability, incredible quality, the possibility to reproduce this in the different carvings and to satisfy the consumers in the other part. This is, for example, a case from an article of Stephanie Porras, in which there is this piece in Badajoz, in Spain, in the cathedral, in which this type of fantastic, amazing and beautiful archangel was able, we can see through this, the connections with Africa or India, the carvings in China or Macau or in Manila, the transformation even in New Spain, and then the consumption, the idea that the final target was Spain. The abilities of the Chinese artisans, real experts on trade, caught the attention of members of the religious communities that started commissioning pieces of art. Clergymen commissioned carvings of saints, virgins, and angels in the European Baroque style, while they're highly successful in the markets of Europe and the Americas. Another element, final two comments in this sense, is we cannot separate these beautiful carvings and artistic elements from a level of conflict that existed in the Philippines, in the Parian, and represented, for example, with the different moments of conflict in which dozens of thousands of Chinese were killed in massacres in different moments. Almost every 2 decades were these assassinations. And anyway, they came back and they populate again the Parian. Second, this is not what is called hybrid art. This is an expression in full sense of the abilities and the sensibilities of the creators. It's what Dr. Cialcita mentioned clearly. That he opposes to the idea of an art and a culture that is hybrid or mongrel. He considers, on the contrary, it's an expression in the highest level possible of this art. So, taking into account this final element, we can observe the different levels of interaction from the top of the empire, the merchants that were powerful in many moments, the anonymous artists, and the anonymous producers that supplied the market in faraway places, and using, of course, the Manila Galleon system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Villamar. Questions are keep coming in our Q&A box, but allow me to park first these questions so that later on we can have all these questions in our open forum. So once again, thank you very much, Dr. Villamar, for sharing three important things based on your presentation for tonight. Thank you. Okay, so our third and last panelist for tonight is Dr. Cristil Obispado from the University of the Philippines. She will talk about textiles and other trade goods, Spanish-American Asia-Pacific connection in the 16th century. And Dr. Obispado is an assistant professor of history at the University of the Philippines in Diliman. Last August 2021, she obtained her PhD history degree from El Colegio de Mexico with a dissertation titled The Pacific Sailors, Global Workers at and on the Edge of the Spanish Empire from 1580s to 1640s. Her research works are on the Pacific trade, early colonial Philippines, and labor history. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Obispado.
Okay, sa mga kababayan natin sa Pilipinas, magandang gabi. Nuestros amigos y colegas en Mexico, buenas noches. Before I start my presentation, I would like to thank the Department of Foreign Affairs, PACLAS, and the organizing committee behind the Philippine International Quincentennial Conference for giving me the opportunity to present my research. It's my pleasure to be here and join a panel of such distinguished scholars. Special thanks to Sir Ferdin, Sir Gonar, and Sir Alec. This presentation is based on an article I have submitted for publication, so any comments or suggestions are welcome. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so the title of my presentation, Philippine Textiles and Other Trade Goods, Spanish America and Asia Pacific Connection in the 16th Century. There is an increasing number of works that address the exchanges between Spanish America and Asia Pacific. This paper analyzes the flow of the Philippine trade goods in the Pacific leg of the 16th century global trade. It aims to contribute to the literature by focusing on the 16th century before and immediately after the galleon trade regulation. It is crucial to re-examine this period to understand the dynamics of the early global exchange in the Pacific and to understand how the imposition of Spanish control changed its landscape. For the data, we use archival sources from Archivo General de Indias, principally the report of Philippine products brought to Peru in the 16th century, as well as the Philippine ships that went to Peru rather than New Spain. The paper is divided into two sections. The first part examines the locally produced or manufactured Philippine goods that the officials and sailors of Santa Maria de la Cinta brought on board as consignors or merchants. It's one of the ships sent by Philippine Governor Ronquillo to Peru. In the earlier works on the unauthorized 1581 trade with Peru, done by Fernando Iwasaki, Woodrow Borra, and Luis Alonso, the focus has been the elite officials such as Governor Ronquillo and his intermediaries and merchants traffic goods, a great deal of which came from China. So this time we will focus on the sailors' goods. The second part attempts to look inside the sailors' chests to identify the goods they brought, locate their destinations, and have a closer look at the circulation of the Philippine products, especially the textiles in the 16th century global trade. Through this study, we hope to understand better the Philippine commercial relationship with other regions such as the Spanish America and the Asia Pacific. In the early colonial reports on the Philippines, one of the prevailing themes is the the local products, both raw and manufactured goods, and their potential to be converted into trade goods. Among the products surveyed, cotton, a highly valued commodity in New Spain, and medriñaque stood out. Medriñaque, either the abaca crop or the cloth made of it, was a common product in Cebu, Negros, Baybay, Limacagawayan, Capul, Panay, and Mindanao. On the other hand, cotton was more widespread in Luzon, particularly in the villages surrounding the lake of Bonbon or the present-day Taal, and in Catanduanes. Both Luarca and Muarga also noted that the people from the central Philippines, example Leyte, Ibabaw, Samar, Bohol, Negros, Cebu, Panay, Cuyo, and Calamianes were dressed in garments that were made from fine medriñaque and colored silk. The massive consumption of these fabrics suggests the existence of a well-established specialization in textile manufacturing in the pre-colonial Philippines. These fabrics became crucial during the pre-colonial exchange with Asian neighbors and in the developing colonial economy as a basis of non-monetary tribute. Their use from the monetary to trade goods, their use from tribute to trade goods became notable when the Philippines began to participate in the global trade and extended their consumption to America or Spanish America. Pedro Chirino, a Jesuit historian, claimed high hopes of gaining huge profits from the Philippine products such as textiles, which the native manufactured as garments from cotton and abaca. In 1573, when the first Manila galleons, Espiritu Santo and Santiago, arrived in Acapulco, they brought Chinese silk and Philippine products such as cinnamon, gold, cotton fabric, wax, and earthenware, among others. The Mexican Viceroy Martin Enriquez did not attempt to control this trade through tax imposition, not expecting that the ship's cargoes would sell rapidly and prompt the Philippine merchants to bring more each year. Historian Woodrow Borah argued that the galleon goods offered the American market raw materials and luxury items with great supply and lower prices than Spain. More importantly, Spanish goods such as textiles became scarce at the same time that Peru's silver production increased in unprecedented quantity. On the other hand, the ready access to locally produced Philippine goods made them cheap and popular in Mexico, Peru, and other parts of America. Consequently, the unrestricted trade between Spanish America and the Philippines and the competitive advantage of the latter's local products converted the colony, that is the Philippines, into one of the leading suppliers in the Pacific leg of the global trade from its inauguration in the 1570s to the next 25 years. As the Spanish author Luis Alonso wrote, the Philippine merchandise from spices to textiles complemented the Chinese products and comprised half of the galleon cargoes during the period. The natives had to be mobilized through their tribute and labor to produce the trade goods. As previously mentioned, raw and manufactured goods were the early basis of the Philippine tribute payment. The natives contributed manta, cotton fabric or blanket, Ilocos fabric, hand cloth, bedspread, tablecloth, silk, and cotton stockings. Since the Philippine natives knew how to weave with stripes of red, blue, and other delicate colors, the fabric became one of the first domestic goods loaded into the Manila galleon. These products were celebrated for their quality and abundance, making the Spanish officials assume that with wax and fabric alone, the Philippines could supply the need of the vast kingdom of New Spain. To obtain textiles, they had to tap its production in the domestic and rural areas and mobilize the locals to work, especially the women. In the Visayas, particularly Cebu and Iloilo, a large-scale cotton production started to operate, while in Luzon, the chieftains' maiden daughters participated as makers of kamisa, undergarments, ecclesiastical vestments, and corships. Economic historian Benito Legarda argued that the Philippine textile industry prospered during the galleon trade through the indispensable contribution of women. It is as expected since in traditional Southeast Asian societies, as Fraser Loom mentioned in her work, textiles are considered female goods and expression of their creative power. She added that as they reached marriageable age, they became proficient weavers of sheets, blankets, and pillows, among other textiles. The success of the galleon trade during its initial years posed a threat to the Spanish merchants who had a trade monopoly in America. To help them, the Spanish crown started to restrict the traffic among its colonies a decade after the operation of the Pacific trade, following the report that the Philippine Governor Ronquillo de Peñalosa sent 2 ships in 1580 to 1581 to trade directly with Peru. King Philip II ordered the investigation of these galleon shipments. He also issued royal decrees in 1582 prohibiting the direct navigation between Peru and the Philippines and the re-exportation of Manila galleon goods from Acapulco to Peru. However, the flow of Asian and American commodities in the previously authorized trade routes continued even after the royal restriction. On May 3, 1581, Governor Ronquillo enlisted and notified around 40 ship officials and sailors to serve as crew for the voyage of Santa Maria de la Cinta. The trip aimed to delineate commercial route between the Philippines and Peru and to explore the prospect of an alternative revenue for Manila residents. The ship's register of goods had the list of merchandise that the government officials, crew, and passengers carried for trade. For this research, the 1581 register is supplemented with the testimonies individuals gave in 1582 and 1583 as part of the investigation ordered by the king regarding the products on board Cinta, their origin, and their value. Among those who testified were the galleon master, Francisco de Santana, the chief pilot Pedro Rodriguez, and the accountant Francisco de Urca, and the crew and passengers of San Martin, another ship that left the Philippines in 1582, who witnessed the embarkation of goods into the ship Cinta. Concerning the origins of the products, earlier studies indicated that 51.9% were Chinese iron, sugar, and fine losa, while the remaining 48.1% large Philippine losa and wax. But the present work also found a significant quantity of other Philippine merchandise such as textile. The terms such as medreñaque and lampote, fabrics made from abaca and cotton, and used as tribute goods in the Philippines, suggest that they were locally produced in these islands. Tapis, a Philippine garment for women described as a white sash that runs around the waist, also appeared repeatedly in the register. Occasionally, there is a mention in the record whether the product came from China or the Philippines. For example, mantas de sangley or telilla de oro y seda hechas en esta tierra, gold and silk cloth manufactured in this land, that is the Philippines. However, it must be emphasized that all the commodities brought from the nao or the galleon were usually labeled Chinese or ropa de China. Other trade goods, particularly particular to the Philippines, are coconut oil, bolo with iron handle, and machete. Among the ship crew and officials, the shipmaster Francisco Santana registered under his name 316 arrobas and 16 pounds of Philippine goods, including more than 300 ordinary blankets and another 2,000 blankets, tapis, colored medreñaques, and arpilleras or white wraps, 2 pieces of white and 14 of colored cotton, 20 quintals, 1 arroba, and 4 pounds of cotton yarn, 210 quintals and 9 pounds of wax, 7 quintals and 1 arroba, and 20 pounds of Cera Labrada or carved wax, 140 pieces of large losa, more than 300 pieces of bolo with iron handle, and more than 300 pieces of machete, 75 quintals and 20 pounds of pepper, 2 quintals, 2 arrobas, and 22 pounds of cloves, 13 quintals, 1 arroba and a half, and 1 box of cinnamon, 1 quintal, and 22 pounds of nutmeg, and 3 tibores of sesame. Other ship crew and officials that traded goods are the chief pilot Pedro Rodriguez, who registered through 326 arrobas and 20 pounds of cargoes that comprise blanket, machete, cinnamon, pepper, and more than 4,500 pieces of large losa. Boatswain Miguel de Quevedo, 29 arrobas of large losa. Ship accountant Francis de Urca, 400 pieces of large losa. Hooker Maestre Antonio, 18 arrobas and 16 pounds of large plate and 12 arrobas of medium-sized bowl. Sailor and artilleryman Juan de San Martin, 2 panes de cera or wax cake, 2 white blankets, 2 lubao blankets, and medriñaque. Sailor Antonio Martin, 18 arrobas of losa gruesa. Sailor Pedro Matias, 18 arrobas of cinnamon. Sailor Juan Perez de Arbolache, 7 arrobas and 8 pounds of large losa. The cheapness of Philippine textiles and other goods made them popular in the viceroyalties of Mexico and Peru. As Bonyalian emphasized, the consumption of silk and Philippine cotton, subsumed under the generic name Ropa de China or Chinese fabrics, transcended the social barriers among different classes such as slaves, indigenous people, and mine workers. Other types of Philippine cotton fabrics such as moro and bombon, which possibly came from the villages around Taal Lake between Tulay and Batangas, where both the Muslim communities and cotton crops were present, as well as Ilocos, became popular among the Mexican poor and workers as they used them for lining and making shirts and tablecloths. Furthermore, they preferred sinabafa for making shirts, undergarments, quilts, and blankets because of its whiteness, because it's easy to wash and because of its cheapness. In the absence of Asian fabrics, instead of buying the expensive Spanish silk and wool, the Mexicans would use their cotton textile, which they continuously produce for their household consumption. Lampote was another preferred export good to Mexico. It was a piece of cotton fabric from the Visayas, which its native women weave. They were also used for making shirts, tablecloths, among others. As for their circulation, the register of goods aboard the ship Cinta provides some details. These ships' crew and officials serve as merchants or consignors of Manila residents, merchants, and officials, including a councilman, a field marshal, constables, and other civil and religious officials. It also appears in the register a resident from Villa de Santísima Nombre de Jesus or Cebu as one of the merchandise owners. For the destination of the products, the investigation of the 1581 trip to Peru, the testimonies given by witnesses from 1582 to 1583 revealed the distribution of Philippine goods from Manila to Lima and other regions. Before the ship arrived in the port of Callao, Peru, their consignees had already been designated. Many of them were officials, residents, merchants, and a small number of tailors and priests from the Viceroyalty of Peru. It's worth noting that although the majority of the buyers were from Lima, those from other places are also on the list, like a bishop from Tucuman and a priest, and a few residents from Panama. It is evident that the galleon goods like textiles circulated to Lima and other parts of Spanish America. their continuous reshipment to Peru via Mexico, even after the 1582 prohibition, was justified by the colonial officials from Manila, Mexico, and Lima on the grounds of the scarcity of merchandise like iron and copper, which were needed for the Peruvian mines. Moreover, in the report of the Marquis of Cañete, the viceroy of the Kingdom of Peru, he informed the Spanish king that while Peru was self-sufficient in terms of food, including wine and sugar, it lacked manufactured goods such as silk and other fabrics, which the Philippine trade could supply in great quantity and affordable price. The contraband trade was also prevalent in Central American ports such as Acajutla and Realejo, and contributed to the economic development of the Kingdom of Guatemala, according to Obando Andrade, by establishing a network from its mountainous region to the ports of the Pacific coast. Mule trains were able to bring silver and return with galleon trade goods such as fabrics, tortoise shells, spices, trinkets, and abaca. The 16th century Philippines formally mapped its place in the commercial circuits in Asia and Spanish America. The founding of Manila in 1571 as the Spanish capital of the Philippines became simultaneous with the birth of world trade as it formed the first direct and permanent trade link between America and Asia. The emergence of this global commercial system was propelled by polycenters in Asia and America that facilitated the trade. The Philippines also nourished the trade by participating in and providing various circuits, formal and informal, for the traffic between Spanish America and Asia. Special attention was given to the Philippine Chinese textiles as they corresponded to the local demand of the Spanish Americans. There was an efficient mechanism to secure the goods, first as a tribute and later as trade goods. There was also a market for these commodities since at the time of the silver boom in the viceroyalties of New Spain and Peru, both the Mexican and civilian textile industries were in decline. Hence, the timely inauguration of the Pacific trade and its supply of cheaper items addressed this shortcoming, implementing a royal cedula in 1579, which allowed the Philippines unrestricted trade with New Spain, Peru, Guatemala, and Tierra Firme, further consolidated this trade. It can be observed that until the first decades of the 17th century, Philippine goods continued to have a significant share in the galleon space. Even with the implementation of trade restrictions in the following decades, the traffic of Asian trade goods to Spanish America did not stop. The survey of Philippine trade goods from 1571 to 1600s showed that the Philippine merchandise can be classified into 4 categories: gold, spices and other crops, wax and civet, and manufactured items such as fabrics, tools, and earthenware. As marketable products, the Philippine government required the natives to supply them as tribute goods and bring them to Manila for the consumption of its residents, and as commercial cargoes for the Manila, Acapulco route, and later for Peru and the larger American trade circuit. Among the highly valued non-monetary tribute goods, it's the textile that the Philippines continuously exported throughout the galleon trade. As seen in the 1581 trade, manufactured cloths including Chinese silk, blue kanikis or muslin, Philippine lubao manta, white manta, and medriñaque were present. By using the more comprehensive register of goods, the textile volume would appear as follow: 1 fardo and 12 cajas of silk, 5 cajones of raw silk, 54 fardos and 1 petaca of manta, 1 petaca of thread, and 6 fardos and 3 cajas of ropa de China or Asian fabrics, including the Philippine cloths. Toward the end of the 16th century, the Philippine tribute payment shifted from species to monetary, which slowly discouraged the crop cultivation in the colony. As a result, the products of Chinese origin started to replace those from the Philippines in the galleon trade. At the same time, to protect the Spanish textile industry, the galleon traffic became restricted to the Manila-Acapulco route, while its trade goods had to be limited to 250,000 pesos worth of cargo and a sale value of 500,000 silver pesos. With these new policies, it became difficult and impractical to load the ships with bulky Philippine goods, and consequently, its documented share on the trade went down from 50 to 10% or less. However, the Philippine local economy continued to thrive in the succeeding centuries, although its share in the galleon space was significantly reduced in the official records. Its produce consistently appeared in the register of goods, especially textiles. The attempts to stimulate the trade of local products would finally yield results by the turn of the 19th century, when Mexico became independent from Spain and the galleon trade ended, leaving the Philippine cash crops as the solid base of its economy. These are the works that I cited. Okay. Maraming salamat po. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much, Dr. Obispado. Maraming salamat. Dr. Obispado mentioned about some merchandise or products like gold, spices, wraps, wax and civet, fabric, etc., which are the products being traded, right? Okay. Anyway, for the information of everyone, our three resource speakers, our panelists, are situated from various parts of, of the world. We have Dr. Machuca is joining us tonight, but she's in Paris right now, in France, right, Dr. Machuca? Thank you for gracing the occasion. Thank you so much. While Dr. Villamar is now in
Singapore.
She's in Singapore. Okay.
I am in Thailand.
You're in Thailand. Thank you, Dr. Villamar. And Dr. Obispado is in Mexico.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, we have, looking at the question and answer box, we have 7 questions here. So perhaps I could read some of the questions and we could address this to our 3 resource experts for tonight. Okay, the first one is from Cristobal Dioa. Is Manton de Manila and the Terno Parot Sayaf famous also in Latin America? Who would like to respond to this question?
Christy, do you want to go ahead or can I start?
Yeah, of course, Manton de Manila is popular now in Mexico. I mean, whichever museum you visit in Mexico, Manton de Manila would always be there. Just last week, I went to Museo de France de Mayo, and they are showing there a lot of pieces of Manton de Manila, and yeah, it's popular in Mexico. I think until the present time, no? Yeah.
I'd like to say something too. Yeah, of course, it's it's known in Mexico, but it was more popular in Spain because it was commercialized at the end of the colonial time, also in the 19th century, when there was a direct relationship between the Philippines and Spain, because Acapulco was no more there. There was the independence of Mexico. And I think that the Manton de Manila is a very good example of the influence of Asian textiles that took root in Spain, in the southern part of Spain, like Sevilla or Cadiz, in the region part, which is called Andalusia. The first mantones were commercialized from the Philippines. They came from China, the Philippines, and then Spain. But in the 19th century, we can find some industries that were elaborating the mantones de Manila in Spain. And the first mantones had some Chinese symbols and flowers and animals from China. But then the mantones were more Spanish, with Spanish motifs, with Spanish elements. So I think it's a very good example of these exchanges and influences between Asia and Spain.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Obispada and Dr. Machuca. Thank you. Dr. Villamar, do you have something to say?
I mean, I agree with this element that is contribution of different parts. In terms of the designs, apparently it's more Chinese. Somehow the flowers and the birds and the color looks more like the porcelains in a way, and particularly the Qing style, not exactly the traditional Chinese of previous centuries. This is one, and certainly it is really connected to the place that Dr. Machuca mentioned in the southern part of Spain. The constant, the circularity of information and taste and enjoyment of these products make, for example, that in Mexico became popular by people that wanted to see the tradition of Spain, particularly in the Fiesta de Toros and la Corrida de Toros. The women used to wear the mantón de Manila, but from Spain.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Obispo, Dr. Machuca, Dr. Villamar. Another question, this one is directed to Dr. Paulina. Have you also noticed similarities in how Filipinos and Mexicans carry out Christian feast or festivities? The one who asked this is, she said, she's referring to things which are unique to both.
Well, I've been in the Philippines during the Flores de Mayo. And when I was visiting some towns, really, I said, I am in Mexico. Because I saw many colorful elements, flowers, hanging fruits on the doors. And maybe there are elements that we can find only in the Philippines and in Mexico. I don't know if in other parts of Latin America, but those elements, the flowers, the colorful elements, the fruits that are over there, and the kindness of the people, I think it's very similar between Mexico and the Philippines. Really, for a Philippine and Mexico during a Flores de Mayo fiesta, and for us, it's like being at home. Believe me.
So you see similarities as far as the presentation is concerned about the Flores de Mayo, how Filipinos carry out Flores de Mayo, like the colors of the flowers, the gowns, etc.
Yeah, and I think Cuauhtemoc wants to say something else.
Yes.
Dr. Villamar, what's your take on this?
I take another festivity, the Christmas time, in the traditional way in which in Mexico is carried, particularly this the 7 days between the 16th to the 24th of December, that every day there is a mass, there is a going to church and to have a party, very simple party in terms of drinking a concoction of fruits, etc. This is very similar to the Philippines. And something that is probably Chinese, but came from Philippines, are the faroles, the paroles, that are paper with color. Exactly the same in Mexico and in the Philippines. It's amazing.
Okay, thank you.
The faroles are the lamps.
The lamps, yes.
Yeah, I think it's Chinese.
Dr. Obispado, I'd like to ask, have you witnessed any festivity there in Mexico so far, which you find it very similar or very common also here in the Philippines, based on your experience there?
I think Dia de Muertos. There's a lot of similarities for example, the people get together and celebrate it as part of the culture. What else? Dia de Muertos. Yeah. Well, I think that's Dia de Muertos. Yeah, where you can see the family gathering together and celebrating the Dia de Muertos.
Okay, that's good to know. There's another one interesting question here, no, for Dr. Machuca. Are there records on how plants, especially fruits and vegetables, are transported from the New World to the Philippines and vice versa, as the voyages last for several months?
Well,
the question was from The question was from Mark Potatonon.
Okay, the answer for Mark. I've been working on plants between the Pacific for many years. And believe me that there is little information of how plants were actually transported in the galleons. There are some references that some of the plants were carried in sand, others in small cages surrounded by ground glass so that they wouldn't be eaten by rats, for example. But if you want to know more about this topic, there is a book by Casimiro Gomez Ortega, 1779, and it's actually the instructions that Casimiro Gomez gives for the transportation of plants in the galleons for the Atlantic, but also the Pacific. I think it's, you can download it from the website, Casimiro Gomez Ortega, Instrucciones de Transporte de Plantas. I think it's a name in Spanish, 1779.
Okay, thank you. I think the next one is a comment, if I may read it to everyone. Mexico was way a provincia de España over a colony of Philippines, not in some extent recognized by Madre España not later than 1820, when the dissolution of Mexican independence emerged. This was a manifestation of Dr. Jose Rizal's plan to study the civil revolution in Mexico but failed. My question is that, this is the question goes. My question is that, is the Philippine culture based on food and gastronomic studies essential for the development of Mexican cuisine, or the other way around? Mexican delicacies in some extent propagated and being replicated by all parts of the globe. What can you say about this? So this is about food, basically. I think that this particular question is part of the presentation of Dr. Machuca.
Well, I can be speaking for hours, but as we don't have enough time,
it's okay.
I recommend you to go to my academia website. You can download many of my works there. I've been publishing things on gastronomy, the Mexican influence in the Philippines and vice versa. I have like 2 or 3 articles about that. It's Paulina Machuca /academia. You can find many things on that, because believe me, I can be speaking hours on that.
Are you open to collaborative research like lexicons or lexims? I'm interested, since my work is I do language documentation, like lexicography. I do dictionaries. So if you are interested, we can work we can have a collaborative work with regard to lexicons or common lexicons, food lexicons, where we can see the similarities between the Philippines and Mexico. I think Dr. Villamar would like to say something.
I think the punctual new information, the detailed information about how the living species or animals or plants were transported may be difficult to find. However, what we can understand is that along 2.5 centuries, the transportation and the exchange was really relevant for all the different points of this trading system. Okay. Second, very important, America itself was the source of so many changes in the gastronomy worldwide, like tomato, potato, corn, and so many things that when we see is the Mexican tomato cooked in the Spanish way in the Philippines, something abnormal? No, it's part of the complexity of the process of globalization. It's a product that maybe lasts a little bit to enter into the different societies, like in China, the same the corn, the same the sweet potato, etc., and potato that transformed the agricultures and took perhaps a century, but definitely yes, it was part of this complex system.
Okay, thank you. Cristel, if I may ask, how do you find the Manila mangoes in Mexico compared to our mangoes here?
What? Compare the mango de Mexico compared to mango in the Philippines?
Yes.
Well, actually, mango de Manila, which was not actually from Manila, but from the other part of the Philippines, was regularly sent from the Philippines to Mexico, and I think that continue until now. No, the shipment of mango de Manila that doesn't change until the present time, and of course they have the same taste, no, that sweet taste.
Okay.
You know, I've been to Guimaras, which is a small island, and they say they have the best mango in the world. It's really, really delicious.
Yes.
But I think we have good mango also in this.
But you know, the Guimaras mangoes are big.
They're delicious.
Very delicious. It's so big. Anyway, another question here is from an anonymous attendee. Perhaps I'd like to give this question first to Cristel. What country is more Hispanic in terms of colonial background, the Philippines or Mexico?
What country? That's an interesting question that we cannot answer in 1 or 2 minutes, but we have to remember the distance between the Spanish Peninsula, no, and the Philippines. So in fact, the Philippines was Americanized than Hispanized. I mean, we were colonized not directly, but through Mexico. That's the reason why we can say that we have more similarities with Mexico compared to Spain because of the distance, no, and because also that's the second factor. When we were conquered by Spain, by the mother Spain, it was through the Mexicans. So there were more Mexican people who went to the Philippines than the European themselves. So what would I say is that Philippines was more Americanized than Hispanized. Than Hispanized. So I think that's the more nuanced understanding, no, of the relationship among these countries.
Thank you, Cristel. Dr. Paulina, what's your take on that?
Well, I think it's a very complex question. Because when we speak of Hispanic legacy, we have to speak in terms of religion, food, language, architecture, many, many, many things. And I think that both in Mexico and the Philippines, we have different regions. That's it. The Visayas is not the same as Luzon, and Luzon is not the same as Mindanao. They had different historical processes of Hispanic colonization, but as well as in Mexico, because in Mexico, we have an indigenous region in the south, and maybe the Hispanic elements there may not be the same as the Hispanic elements in the center or in the north. And that is why it is very complex to answer the question.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Paulina. Before I call Dr. Llanes, because he's raising his hand, do you have something to say, Dr. Villamar, about the question?
Well, I think it's really difficult to answer straightforward Mexico or Philippines. But I think the most attractive element of the Philippines is that it became westernized, at the same time became Asianized. This is not my idea, original idea, but Father Javellana. That means it's a society that became so globalized, cosmopolitan, the Philippines, that you can say in any moment that it's Chinese or it's Mexican, it's Spaniard, it's Americanized in the last century. Yes. However, it's a society that really has the vitality, the creativity to be different.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Villamar. I think Dr. Llanes is raising his hand. Do you have something to say, Sir Ferdy?
Yes, good evening to all the speakers. I have a question to Dr. Machuca, Dr. Paulina. Have you interviewed descendants of Filipinos in the areas where you did your research on the making of lambanog? Are there still, Filipino descendants? None?
No, unfortunately, no, because I don't know if I was clear, but there is no more lambanog making in Mexico nowadays. It started in the 18th century, and in the 19th century, the historical records do not mention Filipino people. That means that they married the local women, or vice versa, and there were no more considered as Filipino. So in the 19th century and 20th century, we have no more Filipinos there, but we have the Philippine elements there. I know that there are some last names of Philippine origin near Acapulco. We cannot consider them as Filipino nowadays, but descendants from Filipinos. But they are not in Colima, but they are near the Acapulco region, because the two major places in Mexico where Filipinos established were the Colima region and the Costa Grande. Costa Grande is near Acapulco, 30 kilometers from Acapulco. But it's a very, very interesting history that we are trying to raise the hand and say, hey, there is a forgotten history which is here, because many people, for example, in Colima, they didn't know that tuba was from the Philippines. I am from Colima, and when I started my research and when I started to give conferences, the people said, no, tuba was here from the pre-Hispanic times, because it is a traditional from our states. It's a tradition, and the same thing. You mentioned the words palapa, batalan, etc. In Mexico, they don't know that it comes from the Philippines. So we're trying to rescue this forgotten memory. But it is a little bit hard because we don't know Filipino descendants right now.
Yeah. My question really is about descendants, not Filipinos, but descendants. Have you met these descendants? Do they know that they are descendants of Filipinos?
Maybe yes. In Acapulco, I have a student who is from Acapulco. She started to make some research, and she found some families that, in their memory, they said that they gather some memories of the Filipino origin. And there may be recent Filipino migrants which traveled to Acapulco, but it was not from the colonial times. It's more recent, and for other reasons they are there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Llanes. So many questions are coming in, but unfortunately, we are running out of time. How do we go about it? Like, could our attendees email these questions or email directly these questions to the DFA, to the speakers themselves? may we hear someone from the Department of Foreign Affairs as to how we could, consolidate all these questions so that we can address them as well. Hi, ma'am. Hi, ma'am.
Hi, yes, Dr. Francisco, thank you
Yes,
for that suggestion. And first of all, congratulations to all of the speakers for a very interesting evening. It was an evening well spent for us here in
Yes.
Manila, and thank you for making that happen. The DFA will be very happy to receive the questions and consolidate them and send them to the speakers, if that's okay with the speakers. I will type in the chat box the email address, and those that I don't know how to go about it, but maybe those that have typed in the questions, maybe you can send your questions separately to this email address, and so that we can consolidate them and send them to the speakers for to be addressed properly.
Thank you very much, Ma'am Azucena. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Dr. Machuca, Dr. Villamar, and Dr. Obispado for sharing, for walking us through with your research activities, research undertakings. They are all impeccable. It's really nice. It feels good to listen to all your presentations. I'm sure all our 170 plus attendees have learned something, many things from all of you. Thank you so much. Maraming salamat. Gracias. But before we end, I'd like to call in the DFA Executive Director, Romulo Victor Israel, to give us the closing remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Francisco. On behalf of the National Quincentennial Committee and the Department of Foreign Affairs, particularly Office of American Affairs, I wish to extend our appreciation to the Philippine Academic Consortium for Latin American Studies and all our distinguished resource speakers for a very interesting and insightful exchange this evening. The Philippines shares a special connection with Latin America, grounded on a common history and heritage, which is clearly manifested, as we have heard from our guest experts, in so many aspects, from food to traditions, to arts and language. So our PIQC session for tonight or today is a virtual time machine, which helps us travel from the present to the past and vice versa, revealing that we have only scratched the surface of what hides a plethora of opportunities for deepening our ties in the areas of trade, investment, and people-to-people connections. This academic forum highlights the fact that despite the vast geographic distance of almost 14,000 kilometers, certain commonalities exist between the Philippines and Latin America, particularly Mexico, in our cultural and political makeup. These influences flowed across the Pacific through the 250 years of the galleon trade, discussed by Dr. Villamar, bridging the two continents, Asia and the Americas. Beliefs and ideas were traded as much as merchandise goods, resulting in cross-cultural exchanges. It is important to note that these similarities are still evident up to the present, which Dr. Machuca has underscored as part of a living history. She noted the influences of Philippine culture in Mexico in coconut wine production, coastal gastronomy, and language. Dr. Obispado, for her part, spotlighted the flourishing of Philippine textile industry and the skills of our craftsmen and women throughout the galleon trade. From our perspective in the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Philippines remains committed to further strengthening the bilateral relations with Latin American friends and partners. We can certainly build on existing cultural affinities, but there is still so much more to be done, particularly in raising awareness, appreciation, and promotion of our cultural links, leading to mutually beneficial cooperation between our peoples. So to all our participants and viewers, we hope that we will continue our pursuit of collective knowledge about our historical connections, not to settle for a little learning, but to drink deep and taste the Pierian Spring through the excellent offerings that we have from the PIQC. A second panel, I believe, will be presenting more on these cross-cultural encounters in the New World, which was opened up by the colonial era. And so as we leave today's session, we look forward to rediscovering the old and exploring the new frontiers for engagement and cooperation. Maraming salamat po. Muchas gracias.
Maraming salamat. Thank you very much, Sir Israel. Thank you. Thank you for giving us the closing remarks. We are fortunate to have the following email addresses. So for those who would still like to ask questions, you can email your questions or comments to the DFA, oaa@dfa.gov.ph. Again, it's oaa@dfa.gov.ph. But for those who like to direct the email, the questions, you can to Dr. Machuca, you can email her. She posted her email account or email address here in the chat box. It's paulinamachuca@hotmail.com. So once again, yes, Dr. Machuca, any final word?
No, very easy.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. And this has been a meaningful night, an insightful night. We will all bring all these learnings to to our classrooms, especially as most of the attendees are teachers and educators in various institutions in the Philippines. Once again, thank you very much. Good night here in the Philippines. Good morning in France, Dr. Machuca and
Mexico.
Dr. Villamar. Good evening in Thailand. And in Mexico,
It's
good
morning.
morning. Good morning. Okay. Thank you very much. Good night.